I'm Cassandra Reynolds, 34, and I never thought I'd see my own parents throw me and my two young children out into a blizzard at midnight. All because I bandaged up a bleeding stranger who collapsed on our family ranch's doorstep during Christmas Eve dinner. "Get that filthy cowboy trash out of my house," my father had screamed, his face purple with rage. Little did they know, the wounded man in tattered clothes was actually Nathan Blackwood, the billionaire who would forever change the power dynamics of our entire family. If you've ever had your family betray you when you needed them most, you'll understand the shock I felt that night. The bitter cold wasn't nearly as painful as seeing my own parents choose their pride over their grandchildren's safety. I'm sharing my story because sometimes family karma comes in unexpected packages. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. I'm curious how many of you have experienced that moment when you realized blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. If this resonates with you, please consider subscribing to hear more stories about family betrayal and unexpected redemption. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. 3 years before that fateful Christmas Eve, my life had been completely different. I was working as an emergency room nurse in Chicago, married to my college sweetheart Tom, and raising our two beautiful children, Emma and Jake. We weren't wealthy, but we were happy. Then came the ice storm that changed everything. Tom was driving home from his night shift when a drunk driver hit him head-on. He died instantly. The drunk driver walked away without a scratch. After Tom's death, I spiraled. Between grief, single parenting, and the relentless pace of the ER, something had to give. When budget cuts eliminated my position, it felt like the universe was kicking me while I was down. At 31, I found myself unemployed, widowed, and struggling to keep a roof over our heads. Pride is a luxury when your children are hungry. So I swallowed mine and called my parents. Harold and Margaret Reynolds owned one of the largest cattle ranches in Montana. 5,000 acres of prime grazing land, a sprawling ranch house that looked like something from a magazine, and enough wealth to never worry about anything. To the outside world, they were pillars of the community. Generous donors to conservative causes, fixtures at charity galas, and proud grandparents who displayed photos of their 4 grandchildren on the mantle. What the photos didn't show was how those grandchildren were divided in their affections. My sister Stephanie had done everything right in our parents' eyes. She'd married Richard Caldwell, the son of a banking family, straight out of college. She had 2 perfect children, Amelia and Liam, who were being groomed for elite universities from preschool. She maintained the right figure, joined the right clubs, and never questioned our parents' values. I, on the other hand, had been the family disappointment since declaring I wanted to be a nurse rather than attending law school as my father had planned. Nursing is a respectable career for someone who couldn't aim higher, my mother had said when I announced my college plans. That backhanded compliment was typical of Margaret Reynolds, a woman who wielded social status like a weapon and saw her daughters primarily as extensions of herself. When I called them after losing my job, their response was swift but conditional. "Of course you and the children can come stay at the ranch," my mother had said, her voice simultaneously sympathetic and triumphant. "We always knew you'd need to come home eventually." That hospital work was never suitable for a Reynolds. I didn't bother correcting her that I'd been a Barnes since marrying Tom. In her mind, I'd always be a Reynolds, just a disappointing one. The guest house on my parents' property became our home. It was spacious compared to our Chicago apartment, with mountain views that took my breath away each morning. Emma, 8, and Jake, 6, initially thrived with the open space, the horses, and the attention from grandparents they'd previously only seen twice a year. But the honeymoon period didn't last. Within weeks, the passive-aggressive comments began. About my parenting, "Emma should really be in dance classes, Cassandra. All the Caldwell cousins are." About my appearance, "You really should try to lose that pregnancy weight, dear. It's been years." About my future, "Richard has a colleague who's recently divorced. He's a bit older but very established. I've invited him to dinner next week." My father was more direct in his disapproval. Harold Reynolds had built his empire through ruthless business tactics and expected the same hardness from his family. He'd been distant during my childhood, more concerned with acquiring the neighboring properties than attending school events. Now in his 60s, he developed a vineyard-like collection of resentments that he cultivated daily. "When are you planning to get back on your feet, Cassandra?" he'd ask while watching Jake play with trucks on the floor. "You can't expect to live off family charity forever." I'd wanted to scream that I was applying for every nursing position within 50 miles, that I was saving every penny of my unemployment, that I wasn't choosing this dependence. Instead, I smiled tightly and assured him I was working on it. The contrast between how they treated my children versus Stephanie's became increasingly painful to watch. When Amelia and Liam visited, they received expensive gifts, endless praise, and my parents' undivided attention. My children received tolerance and constant correction. "Emma, ladies don't sit like that," my mother would scold. Or, "Jake, that's too much dessert for a growing boy. We don't want you ending up chubby, like your cousin from her father's side." The isolation of ranch life during winter only intensified our situation. The nearest town was 30 minutes away in good weather, nearly unreachable during storms. My job prospects dwindled as winter approached. I found part-time work at an urgent care clinic, but it barely covered essentials for the kids. I remained dependent on my parents' charity, a fact they never let me forget. As Christmas approached, the tension in the house grew palpable. The annual Reynolds Christmas Eve dinner was my mother's crowning social achievement each year. 40 guests from the county's wealthiest families, elaborate decorations that took a week to arrange, and a catered meal that cost more than my monthly nursing salary had been. It was less a family celebration than a power demonstration. "This year we've invited the Andersons," my mother announced at breakfast 3 days before Christmas. Their son just sold his tech startup for millions. Recently divorced too. The meaningful look she gave me made her intentions clear. "Mom, I'm not interested in being set up," I said firmly. "Don't be ridiculous, Cassandra. You can't spend the rest of your life as a widow. What kind of example does that set for Emma and Jake? Children need a father." "They had a father," I snapped, immediately regretting it when Emma looked up from her cereal with sad eyes. My mother pursed her lips. "Well, he's gone now, and practical considerations remain. You can at least make conversation with Bradley Anderson. Wear the black dress I bought you. It hides your figure flaws." That evening, Stephanie and her family arrived for their Christmas stay. The difference in reception was immediate and stark. My parents embraced Amelia and Liam with genuine warmth, exclaiming over how tall they'd grown and how smart they looked. When my children ran to greet their grandparents minutes later, they received polite pats on the head and comments about wiping their shoes better. Later that night, I overheard my father and Richard discussing business in the study, their voices carrying through the old heating vents. "The Blackwood deal could change everything," my father was saying. "If we can get Nathan Blackwood to agree to our water rights proposal, the eastern properties will triple in value overnight." "He's a hard man to reach," Richard replied. "The Cowboy Billionaire routine isn't just for the magazines. He actually does inspect potential acquisitions personally, disguised as a ranch hand sometimes." "Myth and marketing," my father scoffed. "No billionaire CEO is mucking stalls incognito. But if playing along with the folklore gets him to sign the contract, I'll buy him a damn cowboy hat myself." I drifted away from the vent, uninterested in my father's business schemes. I had more immediate concerns, like how to create a Christmas morning that would feel special for my children despite our circumstances. I'd managed to save enough to buy Emma the art set she wanted and Jake the dinosaur collection he'd been talking about for months. They were modest gifts compared to what Stephanie's children would receive, but they represented hours of extra shifts and careful budgeting. Little did I know that Christmas Eve would bring a stranger to our door, who would upend everything I thought I knew about my family and force me to redefine what true wealth really meant. Christmas Eve arrived with picture-perfect snow falling gently outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of my parents' great room. Inside, everything was equally perfect, calculated perfection being my mother's specialty. Crystal glasses sparkled under custom chandeliers. The massive pine tree in the corner dripped with antique ornaments and coordinated ribbon. Even the fire in the stone fireplace seemed to crackle on cue. I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the scene unfold with the detached interest of an anthropologist. The county judge and his third wife laughed too loudly at something my father said. The bank president's daughter played a flawless but soulless rendition of Silent Night on our rarely used grand piano. Stephanie circulated effortlessly in her red silk dress, her hand perpetually resting on Richard's arm as they moved from group to group. "Mommy, when do we get to eat?" Jake tugged at my black dress, the one my mother had chosen because it hid my figure flaws. "Soon, buddy," I said, smoothing his cowlick. "Why don't you and Emma go play with Amelia and Liam? They're in the game room." Jake's face fell. Amelia said we're too little for their game. Before I could respond, my mother appeared at my elbow, a fixed smile on her face. "Cassandra, you haven't spoken to Bradley Anderson yet. He's been asking about you." "I've been helping in the kitchen, Mom." "The caterers are paid to handle that." She took my elbow firmly. "Bradley is by the fireplace. He's just bought the old Wilson property, 2,000 acres. Divorced last year, no children to complicate things." I allowed myself to be steered across the room, mentally calculating how many more hours until I could put the kids to bed and escape this performance. Bradley Anderson turned out to be a balding 40-something with wandering eyes that spent more time on my chest than my face. "Your mother tells me you're a nurse," he said after introductions. "That must be rewarding." He said rewarding the way one might say smelly. "Very," I replied. "Especially the emergency department. You never know what's coming through those doors." The conversation limped along painfully until dinner was announced. I escaped around to my children, finding them sitting alone in the game room while their cousins had apparently moved elsewhere. I felt a stab of protective anger seeing their excluded expressions. The long dining table gleamed with silver and china that had survived the arduous journey west with my great-grandmother, or so the family legend claimed. I suspected my mother had actually purchased it all at auction. I was seated beside Bradley, with Emma and Jake placed at the far end of the table with the other children. The strategic distance between us wasn't accidental. Outside, the gentle snow had transformed into something more ominous. Wind howled around the eaves, and the picture windows revealed a whiteout condition developing. Several guests expressed concern about driving home later. "Nonsense," my father boomed from the head of the table. "Montana blizzards are like Montana marriages, intense but brief." This earned dutiful laughter, though several guests continued glancing nervously at the windows. The first course had just been served when the pounding started. 3 heavy thuds against the front door, barely audible above the dinner conversation and howling wind. I noticed only because I'd been watching the storm instead of listening to Bradley's monologue about property values. Another series of thuds, louder this time. A few heads turned. "Probably a branch blown against the house," my father said dismissively. "Richard, you were saying about the Henderson acquisition?" The third set of thuds was accompanied by a voice, faint but unmistakably human. I was on my feet before I realized I'd moved. "Someone's out there," I said, already heading for the door. "Cassandra, sit down," my mother hissed. "The staff will handle it." But the catering staff were all busy in the kitchen, and something in that weak knocking spoke to my emergency room instincts. I pulled open the heavy oak door to a blast of snow and frigid air. And a man collapsing forward across the threshold. He was bundled in a worn canvas jacket crusted with snow and something darker. A cowboy hat had been pulled low over his face, but it fell off as he stumbled. Dark hair, a few days' stubble, and skin frightening pale against weather-tanned features. Most alarming was the crimson stain spreading across his left side. "Help," he managed before his knees buckled. My training kicked in instantly. I caught him as he fell, lowering him to the entryway floor while calling over my shoulder, "I need clean towels and a first aid kit." The man was in his mid-30s, lean but strong, with the calloused hands of someone who worked outdoors. Blood was seeping through his layers of clothing from what appeared to be a wound in his side. "Sir, can you hear me? I'm a nurse. Can you tell me what happened?" I was already assessing his pulse and breathing. His eyes fluttered open, startlingly blue against his pale face. Truck slid off-road. Piece of metal. When I tried to get out. His breathing was labored, but not critically so. Footsteps approached from the dining room. I expected help, but instead found my father looming over us, his face contorted with disgust. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, as if I'd dragged in a dead animal rather than an injured human being.
"He's hurt, Dad.
He needs medical attention." My father's eyes narrowed as he took in the man's appearance, the worn jeans, scuffed boots, and work-roughened hands. In Harold Reynolds' carefully stratified world, this man belonged firmly at the bottom. "Get him out of here," he said coldly. "Call the sheriff if you must, but I won't have some drifter disrupting our dinner." "He's not a drifter, he's injured," I shot back, shocked. "And there's a blizzard. We can't just—" I said, "Get him out." My father's voice rose to a shout that brought conversation in the dining room to an abrupt halt. "We have the county's most prominent families here tonight." The injured man tried to push himself up. "Don't want trouble," he mumbled. "Just needed help. To call someone?" "Dad, he could die out there," I said, my voice low and intense. My mother appeared beside my father, taking in the scene with horror. "Harold, the guests," she whispered urgently. "This is embarrassing."
Something in me snapped.
Perhaps it was months of swallowed pride, or seeing my children excluded, or simply the medical professional in me that couldn't fathom denying help to someone bleeding on Christmas Eve. "I'll take him to the mud room," I said firmly. "I can treat him there, away from your precious guests." Without waiting for permission, I helped the man to his feet and guided him down the hall toward the mud room at the back of the house. I could feel curious eyes following us as we passed the dining room doorway. "Cassandra." My father's voice held a warning I chose to ignore. The mud room was warm at least, with a bench where I could examine him properly. Emma appeared in the doorway, eyes wide with concern. "Mommy? Is he hurt?" "Yes, sweetie. Can you go to our bathroom and get my work bag? The black one under the sink." She nodded solemnly and disappeared. I turned my attention back to the man who was trying to stay conscious. "I'm Cassandra," I said, helping him remove his jacket to better access the wound. "What's your name?" "Nate," he replied, wincing as the movement pulled at his injury. "Nate Black, just Nate." Emma returned with my emergency medical bag, a habit from my nursing days I hadn't been able to break. Inside were basic supplies: gauze, antiseptic, bandages, and over-the-counter medications. Not ideal for a puncture wound, but better than nothing. "Thank you, Emma. Can you go check on your brother now?" Once she left, I cut away the blood-soaked fabric of Nate's shirt to reveal a 3-inch gash in his side, just below the ribs. It was deep but had missed anything vital from what I could tell. "You're lucky," I told him as I cleaned the wound. "A few inches higher, and we'd be having a different conversation." He managed a weak smile. "Lucky's not the word I'd have chosen, but I take your point." As I worked, he explained how his truck had hit black ice and slid off the road into a ditch. When he tried to climb out of the wreckage, a piece of torn metal had caught him. He'd seen the lights of the ranch house and walked nearly a mile through the blizzard before reaching our door. "You should call someone," I said, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. "Family? A friend?" A shadow crossed his face. Phone was in the truck, and I was traveling light, wanted some solitude. I was applying the final bandage when my father burst into the mudroom, this time with Richard in tow. His face was flushed with anger and something else. The slight slurring of his words suggested he'd been hitting the whiskey heavily. "This ends now," he announced. "I've called the sheriff. They'll send someone when the road's clear." "He needs a doctor, Dad, not the sheriff," I argued. "What he needs isn't my concern," my father snapped. "I have guests to consider." Nate tried to stand, stumbling slightly. "I should go. Don't want to cause problems between you and your father." "You're not going anywhere in this condition," I said firmly, then turned to my father. "Dad, it's Christmas Eve. We can't send an injured man back into a blizzard." My father's gaze hardened. "This isn't a public hospital, Cassandra. This is my home, and I decide who stays and who goes." "Then I'll drive him to town myself," I countered. Richard cleared his throat. The roads are completely snowed in, Cassandra. No one's driving anywhere tonight. Then he stays until morning, I insisted. My father stepped closer, lowering his voice to a menacing growl. I will not have filthy cowboy trash in my house while I'm entertaining the Andersons and Judge Whittaker. Get him out or what, Dad? I stood my ground. Or you can join him outside. The words hung in the air between us, shocking in their cruelty. I stared at my father, searching for any sign that he was bluffing. There was none. Behind him, Richard looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. You can't be serious, I finally said. My children are here. Should have thought of that before you decided to turn my home into a homeless shelter on Christmas Eve. My father turned to leave, then paused. You have 10 minutes to get that man out of my house, or I'll have Richard and the Anderson boys throw him out, and you with him if you interfere. After he left, I stood in stunned silence. Nate struggled to his feet. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I never meant to come between you and your family. I made a split-second decision I would never regret. Wait here. I found my children in the kitchen, sneaking cookies with the catering staff who had kindly given them plates while the adult dinner continued. Emma, Jake, we need to get our coats on. Are we going home? Jake asked hopefully. I nodded, not trusting myself to explain the full situation. Get your warmest things. As they ran to gather their coats, my sister Stephanie intercepted me in the hallway. What's going on? Dad's furious, and Mom's telling guests there was a misunderstanding with a trespasser. I quickly explained the situation. He's seriously throwing us out on Christmas Eve because I helped an injured stranger. Stephanie's expression wavered between concern and calculation. You know how Dad gets when he feels his authority is challenged. Just apologize and send the man to the bunkhouse with the ranch hands. The bunkhouse is dark and cold. No one's there for the holidays. And I won't apologize for basic human decency. Then at least leave the kids here, she urged. They shouldn't suffer because you're being stubborn. I almost considered it for half a second.
No.
I won't separate from my children. The unspoken truth hung between us. I didn't trust my parents with them anymore. Stephanie's expression hardened. You always do this, Cassandra. Create drama and expect everyone else to manage the fallout. Is that what you think helping an injured person is? Creating drama? She glanced toward the dining room where parents were salvaging their social event. I think you've never understood what matters in this family. Maybe tonight's making that very clear, I replied, turning away to help my confused children into their snow gear. 10 minutes later, we stood at the back door with Nate, who was looking increasingly worse, but insisted he could walk. My father appeared with Richard and two other men I recognized as Bradley Anderson and his brother. Time's up, my father announced. You're really doing this? I asked, still unable to believe it had gone this far. Throwing your daughter and grandchildren out in a blizzard on Christmas Eve. For just a moment, something flickered across my father's face, doubt, perhaps, or shame. But then my mother appeared behind him, her social mask firmly in place. Cassandra has made her choice, she said coolly. Perhaps some time in the guest cabin will help her reconsider her priorities. The guest cabin. So they weren't completely throwing us to the wolves, just exiling us to the unheated, minimally furnished structure a quarter-mile from the main house. Used occasionally for hunting parties, it was little more than a shell in winter. There's no heat, I protested. There's a fireplace, my father countered. And you've made it clear you prefer the company of drifters to family, so consider it a Christmas gift. I looked to Stephanie, standing in the hallway behind our parents. Steph, please. She looked away, her loyalty, as always, lying with power rather than principle. Emma began to cry quietly, while Jake looked up at me with confused trust that broke my heart. I knelt down to their level. We're going on adventure, I told them with forced cheerfulness. Like camping but in a cabin. My father opened the door, letting in a blast of snow and wind. Merry Christmas, Cassandra. Perhaps tomorrow you'll remember what family loyalty means. With Nate leaning heavily against me and my children clutching my hands, we stepped out into the howling blizzard, the door closing firmly behind us. The world outside had transformed into a swirling white void. Wind slashed at our faces as we struggled through knee-deep snow, heading in what I hoped was the direction of the guest cabin. Emma and Jake trudged beside me, their small faces pinched with cold despite being bundled in layers. Nate was trying to walk on his own, but his injury and blood loss made him unsteady. "It's not far," I shouted over the wind, though I was increasingly unsure of our direction. In the summer, the path to the guest cabin was a pleasant 5-minute walk. In a blizzard at night, it might as well have been crossing the Arctic. Jake stumbled and began to cry. Without hesitation, Nate stopped and scooped him up with his good arm, grimacing through obvious pain. "I got him," he said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Just point the way." 20 agonizing minutes later, the dark outline of the cabin finally emerged from the whiteout. My fingers were so numb I struggled with the key, eventually forcing the frozen lock to turn. We tumbled inside to darkness and bone-chilling cold, but at least we were out of the wind. "Stay by the door," I instructed everyone, feeling my way to where I knew emergency supplies were kept. My fingers closed around a flashlight, and its weak beam illuminated our shelter for the night. The guest cabin was rustic at best. One main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchenette, a bathroom, and 2 tiny bedrooms. It smelled of dust and disuse. A thin layer of frost had formed on the inside of the windows. "Mommy, I'm cold," Emma whispered, her teeth chattering. "I know, sweetie. We'll have a fire going soon." Thankfully, there was a stack of firewood beside the fireplace and matches in the emergency kit. While I built a fire, Nate entertained the children despite his obvious pain, asking them about their favorite Christmas traditions to distract them from the situation. "One year," he told them as the first flames flickered to life, "I spent Christmas in Wyoming during a cattle drive. We made decorations from things we found, pine cones and bits of colored string. Sometimes the simplest celebrations are the most memorable." As the cabin slowly warmed from freezing to merely chilly, I took stock of our situation. The emergency supplies included some canned food, bottles of water, blankets, and basic first aid items.
We wouldn't starve tonight, at least.
After settling the children with soup warmed over the fire and wrapping them in every available blanket, I checked Nate's wound. The bandage had soaked through, and his skin felt hot to the touch. "You're running a fever," I said quietly, replacing the bandage with supplies from the first aid kit. "The wound might be infected. You need antibiotics." "I've had worse," he replied, though his strained smile didn't reach his eyes. Once the children had fallen asleep in the smaller bedroom, exhausted from the ordeal, Nate and I sat by the fire. I couldn't stop the tears that finally came, tears of anger, humiliation, and betrayal. "I'm so sorry you and your kids are going through this because of me," Nate said, passing me a mug of the instant coffee I'd found in the supplies. "It's not because of you," I replied, wiping my eyes. "It's because my parents care more about appearances than people. Always have. Still, most folks wouldn't have helped a stranger the way you did, especially not at the cost of their own comfort and safety." I shrugged. "I'm a nurse. Helping people is what I do." "Used to do," he corrected gently. "Your father mentioned you're staying with them temporarily?" The simple question opened a floodgate. Perhaps it was the trauma of the night or the strange intimacy that comes from facing adversity together, but I found myself telling this stranger my life story, my husband's death, losing my job, the humiliating return to my parents' home, and the constant subtle cruelties my children and I had endured. "The worst part is seeing how they treat my kids," I confessed. "Emma and Jake are just as much their grandchildren as my sister's kids, but you'd never know it." Nate listened without interruption, his blue eyes thoughtful in the firelight. When I finally ran out of words, he seemed to make a decision. "I haven't been entirely honest with you, Cassandra," he said quietly, shifting to reach into his pocket. He winced with the movement. "I do have a phone. I was taking some time away, trying to remember who I am beneath the noise." He pulled out a satellite phone, an expensive model I recognized from the hospital's emergency response team. "You should call someone," I urged. That wound needs proper medical attention. I will. But first, I think you deserve to know who you've actually taken in. He hesitated, then continued. My name isn't just Nate. It's Nathan Blackwood. The name hung in the air between us. Nathan Blackwood. The billionaire my father and Richard had been discussing. The Cowboy billionaire, whose company had been buying up ranches throughout Montana. The man my father was desperate to impress with a business proposal. You're joking, I said flatly. I wish I were. Might make my life simpler. His fever-bright eyes held mine. I really did crash my truck in the storm. But I was out here. Well, incognito is the polite term. Scouting properties personally is how I operate. I remember the conversation I'd overheard between my father and Richard. They said sometimes you disguise yourself as a ranch hand to inspect properties. He nodded. People show their true nature when they think you're nobody important. I've found it educational. A hysterical laugh bubbled up from my chest. So my father just threw the billionaire he's been courting for months out into a blizzard because he looked like a cowboy? Seems that way. And now we're all freezing in this cabin because he couldn't see past his own prejudice. Nate's expression grew serious. From what I've seen tonight, you're better off away from that house, regardless of who I am. I stared into the fire, processing this revelation. Why tell me now? Because tomorrow I'll have to call my security team when the storm breaks. Things will get complicated. And because you deserve to know that your father's water rights proposal, the one he's so desperate to have me sign, involves diverting resources from smaller ranches downstream, including properties that were originally stolen from indigenous families decades ago. That sounds exactly like something my father would do, I said bitterly. Nate studied me for a moment. Can I ask you something personal? I gestured around the cabin. I think we're beyond formalities at this point. Why do you stay? With your parents, I mean. You're clearly capable, educated. There must be other options. The question cut to the heart of my situation. Fear, I admitted finally. Fear of failing my children, of not being able to provide for them on my own. This arrangement is degrading, but it's secure. They have food, shelter, good schools. And psychological damage from watching their mother be belittled and their own worth measured by their grandfather's warped values, Nate observed quietly. His words stung because they echoed my own unspoken fears. Before I could respond, Jake appeared in the bedroom doorway, his hair tousled from sleep. Mommy? I had a bad dream. I opened my arms and he rushed into them, burying his face against my shoulder. Grandpa was yelling and saying we couldn't come back ever, he mumbled. It was just a dream, I soothed, though the reality wasn't much better. We're safe here. Are we having Christmas tomorrow? He asked, his voice small. My heart sank. The children's presents were still hidden in my closet at the guest house. Another casualty of tonight's disaster. Of course we are, Nate interjected, surprising me. Christmas isn't about where you are or what you have. It's about who you're with. Jake looked at him with childish skepticism. But what about presents? Santa won't know we're here. I bet he will, Nate said with conviction. Santa's pretty smart that way. After I tucked Jake back into bed, I returned to find Nate looking feverish but determined. I need to use the satellite phone, he said. My security team can't get here until the storm breaks, but they can make some calls. I raised an eyebrow. Calls about what? His answering smile held a hint of mischief despite his obvious discomfort. Christmas for two resilient kids who deserve better than they got tonight. As he made his calls, I changed his bandage again and gave him some over-the-counter pain medication from the first aid kit, woefully inadequate for his condition, but all we had. His fever was worse, and I was genuinely concerned about infection setting in. You should try to sleep, I told him after he finished his calls. Your body needs rest to fight infection. He nodded, suddenly looking exhausted. Wake me if anything changes. I helped him to the couch nearest the fire and covered him with a blanket. As he drifted into a restless sleep, I sat vigil, watching the flames and contemplating how completely my life had changed in a single evening. My relationship with my parents was irrevocably damaged. My children had witnessed cruelty they wouldn't soon forget. And somehow, improbably, a billionaire was sleeping on our makeshift couch, feverish from a wound he received trying to find shelter with the wrong family on Christmas Eve. The absurdity of it all was almost enough to make me laugh, if it weren't for the very real consequences we'd all face when morning came. I must have dozed off in the early hours of morning, because I woke to Emma gently shaking my shoulder. Sunlight streamed through frost-covered windows, and the blizzard had given way to that peculiar stillness that follows heavy snow. The fire had burned down to embers. "Mommy, Mr. Nate isn't waking up," Emma whispered, her eyes wide with concern. I was instantly alert, crossing to where Nate lay on the couch. His skin burned with fever, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. The infection was worse, much worse. I needed to get him medical attention immediately. The satellite phone lay on the small table where he'd left it. I picked it up, found the last number dialed, and pressed call. A crisp, professional voice answered on the second ring. "Blackwood Security." "This is Cassandra Reynolds," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "I'm with Nathan Blackwood at the Reynolds Ranch guest cabin. He's very ill and needs medical attention immediately." There was a brief pause then. "We're 20 minutes out, Ms. Reynolds. Please stay on the line." 20 minutes? How could they possibly be so close? The answer became clear soon enough. The security team had been monitoring the storm all night, waiting for the first opportunity to reach their boss. The moment the blizzard had broken, they deployed from a staging area in the nearest town. I learned this from the team leader, a former military medic named Davis, who arrived with 3 other men in black SUVs that somehow managed to navigate the snow-covered terrain. While Davis assessed Nate's condition, his team efficiently secured the cabin and established communications. One of them produced a medical kit that made my emergency supplies look like a child's toy doctor set. "For antibiotics," Davis explained as he inserted a line into Nate's arm. "This should stabilize him until we can transport him to proper medical facilities." "Is he going to be okay?" Jake asked, watching the proceedings with fascination. Davis nodded. "Mr. Blackwood is tough. He's been through worse than this." Within an hour, Nate was conscious again, though weak. He insisted on sitting up when he saw the children watching him anxiously. "Told you I've had worse," he said to me with a wan smile. Before I could respond, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors thundered overhead. Another security team member entered the cabin. "Area secure, sir. Medical transport standing by. And there's a situation at the main house." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cabin's temperature. "My parents." The security officer glanced at Nate, who nodded permission to speak freely. "The residents of the main house have noticed our presence and are requesting information." Rather insistently. I could just imagine my father's reaction to black SUVs and a helicopter descending on his property without explanation. Part of me wanted to let him stew in uncertainty, but the children didn't need more drama. "I should go explain," I said, though the prospect filled me with dread. Nate struggled to sit up straighter. "We'll all go. I need to be transported anyway, and your family deserves to understand exactly what happened last night." Davis looked like he wanted to object on medical grounds, but something in Nate's expression silenced him. Instead, he helped Nate into a heavy coat and arranged for one of the SUVs to drive us the short distance to the main house, the snow being too deep to walk comfortably. As we approached, I saw figures gathered on the front porch, my parents, Stephanie and Richard, and several lingering guests from last night's party who had apparently been snowed in. Their expressions ranged from confusion to alarm to outright hostility. My father stepped forward as we exited the vehicle, his face flushed with anger. "What is the meaning of this? Who are these people? Cassandra, explain yourself immediately." Before I could speak, Nate emerged from the SUV, supported by Davis, but standing under his own power. Despite his pallor and obvious weakness, he carried himself with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command. Even in his blood-stained, torn clothing, there was no mistaking what he was now. My father's expression shifted from anger to confusion, then to dawning horror as recognition set in. "Mr. Blackwood?" he stammered, his voice suddenly uncertain. "Mr. Reynolds," Nate acknowledged coolly. "I believe we had an appointment scheduled for next week. Though I must say, this has been a rather unorthodox preview of how you conduct business." The blood drained from my father's face. Behind him, my mother made a small, distressed sound, her hand flying to her throat in the theatrical gesture she reserved for social catastrophes. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding," my father began, his voice taking on the oily tone he used for damage control. "Had we known who you were, that's exactly the problem, isn't it?" Nate cut him off, his voice quiet but carrying across the stunned gathering. "The fact that your treatment of people depends on their net worth." Richard stepped forward, ever the mediator when money was at stake. "Mr. Blackwood, we're all horrified by this unfortunate incident. If you'll come inside, we can make you comfortable while we sort this out." "The same house I was forcibly removed from last night?" Nate raised an eyebrow. "I think I'll decline. My medical team is arranging transport to my ranch. I just wanted to make sure Cassandra and her children had the opportunity to collect their belongings." My mother finally found her voice, though it emerged as a strangled whisper. "We never meant. It was Christmas Eve. We had guests. If only Cassandra had explained who you were." "Would that have made a difference, Mrs. Reynolds?" Nate asked. "Should it have?" No one had an answer for that. My sister Stephanie pushed past our stunned parents, her expression a careful mask of concern. "Cassandra, we were so worried about you and the children all night. The storm was dreadful. Why didn't you call to let us know you were safe?" The audacity of her question left me momentarily speechless. Jake, however, had no such problem. "Grandpa threw us out," he announced to the gathered crowd. "He said Mommy couldn't help the hurt man because he looked dirty." Several of the overnight guests shifted uncomfortably. Judge Whitaker and his wife exchanged glances. Bradley Anderson suddenly became very interested in his shoes. "Out of the mouths of babes," Nate commented dryly. "Children misunderstand adult situations." My father tried to recover. "There were security concerns." "The only security concern," Nate interrupted, "was for a man bleeding in a blizzard and a woman with 2 children who showed basic human decency." He swayed slightly, and Davis steadied him. "Now, I believe Cassandra mentioned needing to collect some things." My mother rushed forward, suddenly solicitous. Of course. Cassandra, darling, everything is just as you left it. And the children's Christmas presents are under the tree, waiting for them. We were going to bring them to you this morning, but the storm." The lie was so transparent it was almost sad. I brushed past her without comment, taking the children to gather our essential belongings from the guest house. While we packed, I could hear raised voices from the main house, my father's protests, Nate's measured responses. When we returned with our hastily packed bags, a tense standoff was underway on the porch. "Your water rights proposal is dead, Reynolds," Nate was saying, his voice carrying despite its weakness. "And my legal team will be looking very closely at your previous land acquisitions, particularly those involving the Chapman Creek watershed." My father had gone from pale to ashen. That was all completely legal. "The documentation was falsified," Nate finished for him. "We know. We've been building a case for months. Why do you think I was out here personally? Blackwood Enterprises doesn't partner with businesses that operate the way yours does." Richard stepped forward, his lawyer instincts engaging. "Those are serious allegations, Mr. Blackwood. Perhaps we should discuss this privately, without an audience." "I don't think so." Nate nodded toward me as I approached with the children. "Are you ready, Cassandra?" I nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. The children clustered close to me, sensing the tension. "Wait," Stephanie said suddenly. "Cassandra, can I speak to you privately?" Just for a moment. I hesitated, then handed my bags to one of the security team members. "Watch the kids for a minute?" I asked him, then followed Stephanie a few paces away. Once we were out of earshot, her carefully constructed concern vanished. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she hissed. That man is threatening to destroy Dad's business. Our family's legacy. I didn't do anything except help an injured person, I replied. Everything else is the consequence of how he was treated. You could fix this, she insisted. You've obviously made some kind of connection with Blackwood. Just tell him it was all a misunderstanding. That Dad was stressed about the party, worried about security. Tell him anything. I stared at my sister, really seeing her for perhaps the first time. The desperation in her eyes wasn't about family loyalty. It was about protecting her comfortable lifestyle, the status and wealth that came from being Harold Reynolds' daughter and Richard Caldwell's wife. I'm not going to lie for them, Steph. And from what I've gathered, Nathan Blackwood already knew exactly what kind of businessman our father is. Last night just confirmed it on a personal level. Her expression hardened. Then you're choosing a stranger over your family. Again. No, I corrected her quietly. I'm choosing integrity over complicity, and my children's well-being over a toxic environment. There's a difference. I turned to walk away, but her next words stopped me cold. I've always protected you, you know. All these years.
Kept your secrets.
The things Dad would have thrown you out for permanently if he knew. I turned back slowly. What are you talking about? Stephanie's smile was ugly with resentment. Ask your billionaire friend about the investigation into Dad's business. Ask him if he knows about the night you were arrested in college, the one I bailed you out of before Dad found out. Or about Jake's father. The test results Richard helped me bury when you were too afraid to tell the family who actually got you pregnant. The blood drained from my face. Jake's father was my husband, Tom Barnes. The DNA test Richard arranged says otherwise. Just a little insurance policy, in case you ever got too self-righteous. She straightened her cashmere sweater. Family loyalty works both ways, Cass. Remember that before you throw us all under the bus for your new billionaire boyfriend. She walked back toward the house without waiting for my response, leaving me frozen in place, my mind reeling with implications. The arrest she mentioned had been a college protest that turned unruly. Hardly a deep, dark secret, though my father would have exploded over the liberal politics involved. But the insinuation about Jake's paternity, that was a deliberate, calculated lie. A poisoned arrow designed to create maximum damage. I rejoined the group in a daze, barely registering when Nate announced we would be leaving. The children hugged their cousins goodbye, the only genuine affection displayed in the entire toxic scene, and then we were being helped into the waiting SUVs. As we pulled away, I looked back at the imposing house where I'd grown up, where I'd returned in desperation, and where I'd finally seen the truth about my family. My mother stood rigid on the porch, my father's hand gripping her shoulder too tightly. Stephanie and Richard huddled in conversation, their expressions calculating. Only my niece and nephew waved goodbye. Are you okay? Nate asked quietly from beside me. I turned away from the window. No, I answered honestly. But I think maybe I will be. The helicopter transported Nate directly to his ranch, while the security team drove the children and me, following behind in one of the SUVs. As Montana's snow-covered landscape passed outside the window, Emma and Jake peppered our driver with questions about helicopters and whether Mr. Nate was going to be all right. Their resilience amazed me, already turning this trauma into an adventure. I, on the other hand, couldn't stop replaying Stephanie's words, searching for the strategy behind them. The arrest allegation was clearly meant to make me doubt whether Nate would still want to help us if he knew about my past. The lie about Jake's paternity was crueler, designed to make me question my own memories and plant seeds of doubt that would poison my relationship with my son. Classic Stephanie, finding the exact vulnerability and exploiting it. I resolved to put her manipulations out of my mind and focus on what mattered. My children were safe. We were away from the toxic environment of my parents' home, and somehow, improbably, we had found an ally in one of the most powerful men in Montana. What that meant for our future remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, I felt something like hope unfurling in my chest. Nate's ranch was nothing like I expected. From my father's endless discussions of Blackwood properties, I'd imagined something ostentatious, a billionaire's playground with unnecessary luxuries and intimidating grandeur. Instead, we arrived at a beautiful but understated property nestled against the mountains. The main house was impressive but welcoming, built of natural stone and timber that blended with the landscape rather than dominating it. A group of staff met us at the entrance, their concern for Nate evident in their expressions. Mr. Blackwood needs rest, the housekeeper, an efficient woman named Martha, announced after introductions. Dr. Patel is waiting in the East Wing. I'll show Ms. Reynolds and the children to their rooms. The rooms turned out to be a spacious guest suite with a sitting area, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom larger than our entire apartment in Chicago had been. Large windows offered breathtaking mountain views, and someone had thoughtfully placed children's books and simple toys on a shelf. "Is this okay?" Martha asked, seeing my overwhelmed expression. Mr. Blackwood called ahead with instructions, but if you need anything different, "It's perfect," I assured her. It's been a difficult 24 hours. Her expression softened. Mr. Blackwood explained a bit of the situation. "There are clothes in the dressers that should fit all of you. We keep various sizes for guests. Dinner is at 6, but I can bring trays up if you'd prefer to rest." After she left, Emma explored the rooms with growing excitement while Jake planted himself by the window, watching the horses in a distant paddock. "Mommy, can we stay here forever?" Emma asked, bouncing on the edge of a bed covered in a hand-stitched quilt. "We're just visiting, honey," I said gently. "Mr. Blackwood is being very kind while we figure out our next steps." "But Grandpa was mean," Jake said, turning from the window. "And Grandma didn't stop him. And Aunt Stephanie was only nice to us when she found out Mr. Nate was important." Out of the mouths of babes indeed. I sat on the bed and gathered them both close. "What happened last night was wrong," I said carefully. "Adults sometimes make bad choices, especially when they're angry or scared." "Were you scared, Mommy?" Emma asked. "Yes," I admitted. "I was scared for both of you, and for Mr. Nate. But sometimes being brave means doing the right thing even when you're scared. Like when you helped Mr. Nate even though Grandpa was yelling?" Jake asked. I nodded. "Exactly like that. I want to be brave like you," Emma declared with the absolute certainty of an 8-year-old. Their simple faith in me brought tears to my eyes. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges we faced, I knew with absolute clarity that leaving my parents' toxic influence behind was the right decision for my children. After we'd all showered and changed into the borrowed clothes, Martha returned to invite us to a late lunch. She led us to a sunny kitchen where a table had been set with simple but delicious-looking food. "Mr. Blackwood is resting," she explained.
Dr.
Patel says the infection is responding to antibiotics, but he needs sleep more than anything. Over lunch, Martha discreetly filled me in on our surroundings. The ranch was Nate's personal residence, separate from the corporate Blackwood properties. He came here to escape the pressures of running a global energy company, often spending weeks working remotely from what the staff called the study, apparently a state-of-the-art office concealed behind the rustic exterior. "He values his privacy," Martha explained. "Most people don't see this side of him." "I got that impression," I said. "The whole Cowboy Billionaire thing, is that real or just a media creation?" Martha smiled. "Both, I suppose. He grew up on a working ranch in Wyoming. His family had some money, but nothing like what he's built. He's more comfortable in boots than boardroom shoes, that's for certain." After lunch, the children discovered a games room where they quickly became absorbed in a complex marble run. I was trying to help them with a particularly challenging section when I heard a throat clear behind me. I turned to find Nate standing in the doorway, looking pale but considerably better than he had that morning. He'd changed into fresh clothes, jeans and a simple button-down shirt that somehow looked both casual and expensive. "Should you be up?" I asked, medical instincts kicking in. "Doctor's orders." "Limited movement encouraged," he quoted with a slight smile. "I see you've found the marble labyrinth. It's addictive, isn't it?" The children immediately abandoned me to show Nate their progress, chattering about the complex route they were creating. I watched their easy interaction with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. The events of the past 24 hours felt increasingly surreal. From family Christmas to blizzard exile to billionaire rescue. Do you feel up to a conversation? Nate asked when the children returned to their project. There are some things we should discuss. We moved to a comfortable sitting room where a fire crackled in a stone hearth remarkably similar to the one in the guest cabin, though considerably cleaner. Through the windows, snow-covered mountains gleamed in the afternoon sun. First, Nate began, settling carefully into an armchair, I want to thank you properly. Dr. Patel says your quick treatment of the wound probably prevented a much worse infection. You may have saved my life. I shook my head. Any decent person would have helped. Evidence suggests otherwise, he said dryly. But that brings me to what we need to discuss. My security team has prepared guest accommodations for you and the children for as long as you need them. There's no pressure to make immediate decisions, but I understand you might be uncomfortable with the arrangement. It's a lot, I admitted. We're grateful, but I don't want to impose. Once the roads are fully cleared, we can return to your parents, he asked quietly. I looked away.
No.
That's not an option anymore. But there must be hotels in town, or, Cassandra, he interrupted gently, there's something else you should know. Something that might affect your decisions going forward. He reached for a folder on the side table, wincing slightly with the movement. My company has been investigating your father's business practices for over a year. It started when we were considering a partnership for the water rights project, but what we found led us in a different direction. He handed me the folder. Inside were documents, photographs, and reports detailing what appeared to be years of illegal activities. Falsified water rights claims, environmental violations, tax evasion, and questionable land acquisitions. Your father has been systematically acquiring land through less than ethical means, Nate explained. In particular, properties that once belonged to the Blackfoot tribe and small family ranches that control key water access. I flipped through the pages, recognizing names of properties and business associates I'd heard mentioned throughout my childhood. You're building a case against him. Nate nodded. The FBI is involved now. There will likely be charges filed within weeks. I set the folder down, my hands trembling slightly. Despite everything, these were still my parents, still the grandparents of my children. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know what you've walked into. And because there's evidence suggesting your brother-in-law Richard has been instrumental in the legal maneuvering. Your sister may be implicated as well. The weight of this revelation settled over me. No wonder Stephanie had been so desperate at the house, so quick to threaten me with fabricated secrets. She wasn't just protecting our parents, she was protecting herself. I didn't know, I said finally. I knew Dad's business ethics were flexible. But this level of corruption. No one expects you to have known, Nate assured me. But now that you do, you have choices to make. If you'd prefer to distance yourself completely from the situation, I understand. I can arrange accommodations elsewhere, help you find employment in another state if you'd prefer. I studied him, this man who'd entered my life so dramatically less than 24 hours ago. Why would you do that? You barely know us. His expression turned thoughtful. Let's just say I recognize the courage it takes to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you something. It's rare. Worth protecting. Before I could respond, Martha appeared in the doorway. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's someone at the gate insisting on seeing Ms. Reynolds. A Stephanie Caldwell. Security has detained her, but she's quite persistent. Nate looked at me questioningly. I sighed. My sister. Your call, he said. If you don't want to see her, she'll be escorted off the property. Part of me wanted exactly that, to avoid another confrontation. Another layer of manipulation. But I also knew Stephanie wouldn't have come unless she felt it was urgent. And despite everything, she was still my sister. I'll see her, I decided. But not with the children present. Nate nodded to Martha. Have security bring her to the front office. And make sure the children are occupied elsewhere. Stephanie looked both out of place and oddly diminished when security escorted her into the tastefully appointed office. Her designer clothes and perfect hair seemed excessive against the authentic Western aesthetic of Nate's home. Her eyes darted around, taking in details she could report back to our parents. "Quite the upgrade from the guest cabin," she remarked by way of greeting. "You work fast." I ignored the insinuation. "What do you want, Stephanie?" "To talk sense into you before you make an irrevocable mistake." She placed her designer purse carefully on a chair. "Dad is beside himself. Mom's had to take sedatives. The family reputation is about to take a much bigger hit than my children and I getting thrown out in a blizzard." I finished for her. "Nate told me about the investigation." Stephanie's expression flickered, her composure cracking slightly. "That's exactly why I'm here. You don't understand what's at stake." "Then explain it to me." She took a deep breath. "Richard says if certain accommodations can be made with Mr. Blackwood, the whole legal situation might go away. A misunderstanding between businesses, nothing more." "Accommodations," I repeated flatly. "You mean you want me to use whatever influence you think I have with Nate to get him to drop a federal investigation into actual crimes?" "They're regulatory issues, not crimes," she insisted. "Every business operates in gray areas." "Fraud isn't a gray area, Stephanie." Her carefully constructed calm began to crack. "Do you have any idea what this will do to us? To my children? If Richard is implicated, if Dad goes to prison, everything will be gone. The properties, the money, our standing in the community." "Maybe you should have thought about that before participating in illegal activities," I suggested. "I didn't participate in anything," she snapped. "I'm just Richard's wife, just Dad's daughter. And that's always been enough for you, hasn't it? Looking the other way, benefiting from their actions without questioning where the money came from or who got hurt." Stephanie's expression hardened. "Not all of us had the luxury of your moral high ground, Cassandra. Some of us had to live in the real world." "The real world where throwing children into a blizzard is acceptable?" "That was unfortunate timing," she conceded. "But you know how Dad gets when he's challenged publicly. If you'd just done what he asked, left an injured man to freeze to death, taken him to the bunkhouse, called an ambulance, anything except creating a scene in front of the most influential people in the county." I stare at my sister, really seeing her for perhaps the first time. "This is still about appearances for you. Even now." She pressed her lips together. "I came here to offer you a deal. A way back into the family, if you help smooth things over with Blackwood." "I don't want a way back in." "Then how about insurance for your future?" She reached into her purse and withdrew a small flash drive. "This contains evidence that might interest your new benefactor. About your past. About Jake's real paternity." I felt cold fury rise within me. "We both know that's a lie. Jake is Tom's son." "The DNA test says otherwise," she countered. "And there's also the matter of your arrest record, your history of psychiatric medication after Tom's death. All sorts of details that might make Blackwood reconsider his white knight routine." "Are you actually blackmailing me right now?" "I'm offering you a choice. Help your family, or watch everything come crashing down, including whatever fantasy you're building here." She gestured around the room. "Do you really think a man like Nathan Blackwood has any genuine interest in a struggling widow with 2 kids and a history of mental health issues? He's using you to get to Dad's properties. Once that's done, you'll be disposable." Before I could respond, the door opened and Nate himself walked in. From Stephanie's expression, it was clear she hadn't expected him to appear. "Mr. Blackwood," she recovered quickly, extending her hand. "We haven't been formally introduced." "Stephanie Caldwell." Nate ignored her outstretched hand. "I heard enough of your conversation to get the gist, Miss Caldwell. You're threatening your sister with fabricated evidence unless she helps obstruct a federal investigation. That's blackmail and witness tampering, both felonies." Stephanie paled. "You are eavesdropping? In my own home? I prefer to call it security awareness." Nate's voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of steel. "Now, I suggest you hand over that flash drive and leave before I have my security team escort you to the sheriff's office." "This is a private family matter," Stephanie protested, though her voice had lost its certainty. "Nothing about fraud and blackmail is private, Nate countered. The drive, please. For a moment, I thought she might refuse. Then, with shaking hands, she placed it on the desk between us. You've chosen your side, she said to me, her voice thick with resentment. I hope you can live with the consequences. After security escorted her out, I sat in stunned silence, processing what had just happened. Nate picked up the flash drive, turning it thoughtfully in his hands. Do you want to know what's on it? He asked quietly. I shook my head. It doesn't matter. Whatever evidence she claims to have about Jake's paternity is fabricated. And the rest? Yes, I was arrested at a college protest for environmental rights. Yes, I took antidepressants after my husband died. None of that is shameful or secret. Nate set the drive down. For what it's worth, I believe you. And none of those things would change my offer of help. Why? I asked the question that had been building since we arrived. Why are you doing all this for us? He was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. 10 years ago, I was in a similar situation to yours. Different circumstances, but the same core problem. People I trusted choosing power and money over basic human decency.
I didn't have anyone to help me then.
I promised myself if I ever had the means to be that help for someone else, I would. The simple honesty of his answer touched something in me that had been frozen for a long time. Not since Tom's death had anyone offered help without conditions attached. Thank you, I said, my voice thick with emotion I couldn't quite name. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. You should check on the children. And I should get back to bed before Dr. Patel hunts me down. We can talk more tomorrow. That night, after the children were asleep in their borrowed beds, I sat by the window watching snow fall in the security lights outside. Stephanie's visit had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. Not her threats, those were desperate and transparent, but the recognition of how completely my family relationships had been built on conditional love and mutual manipulation. Had I really been so blind all these years? Or had I simply chosen not to see what was right in front of me because acknowledging it would have meant acting on it? Tomorrow would bring new challenges. We couldn't stay here indefinitely, living on a stranger's charity. I needed to find work, a place to live, schools for the children. I needed to decide how much, if anything, to tell them about the coming legal storm that would engulf their grandparents. But for tonight, in this quiet moment of reflection, I allowed myself to feel something unexpected. Relief. Relief that the pretense was finally over. Relief that my children would grow up understanding that wealth and status were meaningless without integrity. Relief that, against all odds, we had found a safe harbor in the middle of a storm. Whatever came next, we would face it with the truth, and that was more than I could have said yesterday. The next few days passed in a strange bubble of serenity. Nate recovered quickly under proper medical care, though Dr. Patel insisted he limit his activities. The children explored the ranch under Martha's watchful eye, discovering wonders around every corner: a greenhouse full of vegetables in the dead of winter, a woodworking shop where the ranch manager let them sand small pieces of pine, horses that seemed to pose specifically for Emma's enthusiastic drawings. I spent hours researching apartments in nearby towns, job opportunities for nurses, and schools that might ease the children's transition. Nate provided a laptop and office space, but otherwise gave us privacy and space to adjust. For days after Christmas, as I was comparing rental listings in the breakfast nook, Nate appeared with a folder similar to the one he'd shown me earlier. There's something else you should see, he said, his expression grave. It came up during the investigation into your father's business dealings. Inside the folder was a birth certificate, mine, with unfamiliar names listed as my parents'. Attached was a legal document showing my adoption by Harold and Margaret Reynolds when I was 6 months old. I don't understand, I said, staring at the papers. My parents never mentioned adoption. It appears to have been unusually handled, Nate said carefully. The adoption records were sealed and apparently never intended to be found. I looked up from the documents, my mind racing to process this revelation. Why would they hide this? And why would your investigators even look into my birth? They weren't looking for this specifically, Nate explained. They were tracking land acquisitions your father made in the 80s. One property transaction raised red flags, a ranch belonging to a family named Chapman. The timing and circumstances were suspicious. I looked back at the birth certificate. Mother, Elizabeth Chapman. Father, unknown. Chapman, I repeated. Like the watershed you mentioned. Nate nodded. Chapman Creek runs through what was once Chapman Ranch, land your father acquired 34 years ago through what our investigators believe was coercion and fraud. Elizabeth Chapman was the daughter of the ranch owner. And she was my birth mother? The words felt strange in my mouth. According to these records, yes. There's more, Cassandra, and it's not pleasant. The investigators found correspondence suggesting her father threatened Elizabeth Chapman's father with financial ruin unless he sold the ranch at a fraction of its value. Shortly afterward, Elizabeth discovered she was pregnant. Your father apparently arranged to adopt you as part of the deal, though the legal documentation is questionable at best. My head was spinning. Are you saying my father essentially bought me along with the land? Nate's expression was compassionate but unflinching. The evidence suggests something along those lines, yes. What happened to Elizabeth? To her family? That's where the trail goes cold for several years. The Chapmans left Montana after the sale. Elizabeth apparently tried to find you multiple times over the years, but the sealed adoption records prevented it. He hesitated. She passed away 5 years ago. Cancer. The finality of those words hit me like a physical blow. I'd had a biological mother who wanted me, who had tried to find me, and now she was gone forever. A connection I'd never known existed, now permanently severed. I'm sorry, Nate said quietly. I debated whether to show you this at all, but with the case against your father proceeding, it would have come out eventually. I thought you deserved to hear it from someone who cares about your well-being rather than in a courtroom. I barely registered his words, still staring at the birth certificate. Elizabeth Chapman, a woman I would never meet, whose blood ran in my veins and whose features might be reflected in my face. Is anyone from that family still alive? I asked finally. Elizabeth's mother, your biological grandmother, is still living. Margaret Chapman. She returned to Montana about 10 years ago after her husband died. She lives on a small property near Kalispell. A grandmother. A real grandmother who might have wanted to know me, who might still want to know her great-grandchildren. I need to see her, I said, the decision immediate and irrevocable. Nate nodded as if he'd expected this. I can arrange it if you're sure. I'm sure. The next day found us driving through snow-covered mountains toward Kalispell. Nate had insisted on coming despite his still-healing injury, though he promised to wait in the car if I preferred privacy for the meeting. The children were staying with Martha, who had planned a day of baking and movies. What if she doesn't want to see me? I asked as we neared our destination, voicing the fear that had kept me awake most of the night. From what the investigators learned, Margaret Chapman has been trying to find you for decades, Nate said gently. She never stopped looking, even after Elizabeth died. The property we pulled up to was modest but well-maintained. A small ranch house with smoke curling from the chimney, surrounded by pine trees heavy with snow. A wreath hung on the door, Christmas lights still twinkling along the eaves. Do you want me to come with you? Nate asked as we sat in the idling car. I stared at the house, my heart hammering. Yes, I decided. At least at first. The woman who answered our knock was in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun and eyes so familiar they made my breath catch. They were my eyes, the same unusual gray-green I saw in the mirror every morning. Margaret Chapman? Nate asked politely. Yes, she replied, her gaze moving curiously between us. My name is Nathan Blackwood. This is Cassandra Reynolds. Her hand flew to her mouth, those gray-green eyes widening. Cassandra, she whispered, her voice trembling. Elizabeth's Cassandra? I could only nod, my own voice trapped somewhere between my heart and throat. Margaret Chapman did something then that no one in the Reynolds family had ever done. She opened her arms without reservation, without condition, without judgment, and gathered me into an embrace that felt like coming home to a place I'd never known existed. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of tears, photographs, and stories. Margaret, who immediately asked me to call her Graham, showed me pictures of Elizabeth, a young woman with my coloring and smile whose life had been derailed by Harold Reynolds' ruthless business tactics. "Your grandfather never recovered from losing the ranch," she told me, showing me a faded photograph of a weathered man standing proudly in front of a ranch house much larger than her current home. It had been in his family for 3 generations. When Harold Reynolds forced us out, something in him just broke. "I'm so sorry," I said, the inadequacy of the words painful in my mouth. "It wasn't your fault, child," she said, patting my hand. "You were just a baby. And Elizabeth, she tried so hard to keep you." The story that emerged was heartbreaking in its calculated cruelty. My mother Elizabeth had gotten pregnant at 19 by a local boy who joined the military and shipped out before knowing about the pregnancy. When Harold Reynolds began pressuring the Chapman family to sell their ranch, which controlled critical water access he wanted, he discovered Elizabeth's situation and saw an opportunity. He offered my grandfather a choice: sell the ranch at a fraction of its value and give up the baby for adoption to the Reynolds family, or face financial ruin and public scandal. "Different times," Margaret said sadly. "An unmarried pregnant girl was still cause for shame in our community. And your grandfather's health was failing. He needed specialized care we couldn't afford without the ranch income." Harold Reynolds knew exactly where to apply pressure. But why did they want me? I asked, the question that had been burning since I'd seen the documents. My parents never seemed particularly interested in children, even their biological one. Margaret's expression hardened. It was never about wanting a child. It was about control and ownership. Harold Reynolds took everything from us: the land, the legacy, and even our grandchild. It was the ultimate power play. And my birth father? The boy in the military? "James Collier," she said, the name sending a shiver through me, a name that should have been part of my identity. "He was killed in action before he even knew about the pregnancy. A good boy from a good family. He and Elizabeth had been sweethearts since high school." Nate, who had been sitting quietly while we talked, asked the question I couldn't bring myself to voice. "Did Elizabeth ever try to contact Cassandra?" Pain flashed across Margaret's face. "Every year on your birthday. Every Christmas. She wrote letters the Reynolds returned unopened. She hired lawyers who were mysteriously convinced to drop the case. She even tried to approach you once at a school function when you were about 10. Harold Reynolds had her arrested for trespassing." I closed my eyes, remembering a dim childhood memory I'd almost forgotten: a woman being escorted away by security during a school play, my father's tight grip on my shoulder as he hurried me to the car. "I think I remember that," I whispered. "She never stopped trying to find you," Margaret continued, "even after she got sick. Her last wish was that I keep looking, that I tell you the truth someday." "And my sister Stephanie? Is she also—" I couldn't finish the question. "Adopted?"
No.
"The Reynolds had their biological daughter a few years after they took you. I think Margaret Reynolds felt she had something to prove, that she could have her own child." The revelations continued, each more painful than the last. How the Reynolds had changed my name from Catherine Elizabeth Chapman to Cassandra Margaret Reynolds. How they'd used their influence to seal the adoption records permanently. How they'd threatened the Chapman family with legal action if they ever tried to contact me. "But why keep me at all?" I asked. "If they didn't really want a child, why not just destroy the Chapman ranch and be done with it?" Margaret's expression turned grim. "Insurance," she said simply. "As long as they had you, they knew your grandfather would never fight the land seizure. You were the hostage that kept us in line." As the afternoon wore on, I learned more about my biological family. The grandparents who had searched for me, the mother who had never stopped loving me, the father who had died never knowing I existed. I saw photos of cousins who shared my features, heard stories of family traditions that somehow felt familiar despite being new to me. Eventually, Nate excused himself to make some calls, giving us privacy for the more intimate conversations. As the winter sun began to set, I realized we needed to return to the ranch before dark. "You'll come back?" Margaret asked anxiously as I prepared to leave. And bring those precious great-grandchildren of mine? Of course, I promised, embracing her. This isn't an ending, it's a beginning. On the drive back, I sat in silence for a long time, processing everything I'd learned. Nate respected the quiet, driving steadily through the gathering darkness. I need to confront them, I said finally. My parents, the Reynolds. I need to hear them admit what they did. Nate glanced at me. Are you sure? It won't change the past. No, but it might change my future. And my children's. They deserve the truth, not more lies. He nodded. When? Tomorrow, I decided. Before I lose my nerve. The next morning, after explaining to the children that I needed to have an important conversation with their grandparents, I asked Nate to accompany me to the Reynolds ranch. He agreed without hesitation, though concern shadowed his eyes. The reception at the main house was chilly. My parents had clearly been warned we were coming, probably by the security team Nate had courteously sent ahead to announce our visit. They sat rigidly in the formal living room, my father's face a mask of barely contained fury, my mother's a study in artificial composure. I suppose you've come to apologize, my father began, the arrogance in his tone igniting a spark of anger in my chest.
No, y replica calmly.
I've come for the truth. About my adoption. About the Chapmans. The effect was immediate and dramatic. My mother's teacup clattered against its saucer. My father's face drained of color before flushing dark red. Who told you that name? He demanded. My grandmother, I said, watching their reactions carefully. Margaret Chapman. I spent yesterday afternoon with her, learning all about how you destroyed her family and stole her granddaughter as part of a land grab. Lies. My father spat. Whatever that woman told you. Stop it, I interrupted, surprising myself with the authority in my voice. The documentation exists, Dad. The original birth certificate. The coerced adoption papers. The records of how you systematically prevented my birth mother from contacting me. It's over. My mother set down her teacup with shaking hands. We gave you everything, she said, her voice bitter. Education, opportunity, a place in society. And this is how you repay us? By dredging up ancient history with that. That family is my family, I said quietly. My blood. The people who actually wanted me, not as a pawn in a real estate deal, but as a person. You ungrateful. My father began, half rising from his chair before Nate cleared his throat, the subtle reminder of his presence enough to make my father reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. I'm not here to argue, I continued. I just want you to admit what you did. To my face. No more lies. A heavy silence fell over the room. My father and mother exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, my father's shoulders sagged slightly. It was business, he said flatly. The Chapman property was essential to securing water rights for the eastern expansion. The girl's situation provided leverage. The girl, I repeated. My mother. Her name was Elizabeth. Names don't matter. Results do. His tone was defensive, but held a note of defiance. Everything I did to build something lasting. A legacy. Built on theft and cruelty. Built on seeing opportunities others were too weak to recognize, he countered. The Chapmans were going to lose that land anyway. The old man was ill. The girl was unmarried and pregnant. I offered a solution that benefited everyone. Benefited everyone? I echoed in disbelief. You destroyed their lives. We gave you a better life than they ever could have, my mother interjected. A proper upbringing, connections, social standing. You gave me conditional love and constant criticism, I corrected her. You made me feel like an outsider in my own family because I was. You kept me from people who would have loved me unconditionally. My father's expression hardened. If you've come here expecting apologies or tearful reconciliations, you're going to be disappointed. We did what was necessary. We made you a Reynolds. I never was a Reynolds, I said quietly. Not really. And now I understand why. I stood, suddenly eager to be away from these people who had claimed to be my parents while using me as a pawn in their games of power and status. "The FBI will be contacting you about the investigation," Nate said, speaking for the first time since we'd arrived. "I suggest you get your affairs in order." My father's eyes narrowed. "This vendetta of yours, Blackwood. It won't end well. I still have friends in high places." "So does the justice system," Nate replied evenly. As we prepared to leave, my mother suddenly reached for my arm. "Cassandra, please. Think of your sister. Think of the family name." I gently removed her hand. "Stephanie isn't my sister. And Reynolds isn't my name, not anymore." In the car, the emotion I'd been holding back finally broke free. I wept for the mother I'd never known, for the family I'd been stolen from, for the years of feeling like I never quite belonged without understanding why. Nate drove in silence, occasionally reaching across to squeeze my hand in wordless support. By the time we reached his ranch, I'd cried myself out, leaving a strange sense of peace in the wake of all that grief. The children were waiting anxiously, picking up on the emotional undercurrents even without understanding their cause. I gathered them close, breathing in the innocent scent of their hair, their skin. "I have an amazing story to tell you," I said, leading them to the cozy den where we'd taken to spending our evenings. "About your great-grandmother and your grandmother who loved you very much even though she never got to meet you." As I told them a simplified version of what I'd learned, their eyes grew wide with wonder rather than fear. To them, it was a story of discovery, of finding new family rather than losing old ones. "So Grandpa and Grandma Reynolds aren't really related to us?" Jake asked, processing this information. "Not by blood," I confirmed. "But family is about more than blood. It's about love and caring and always doing what's best for each other." "Like Mr. Nate did when he helped us in the snow?" Emma asked, her perception startling me. I met Nate's eyes across the room, seeing something there that made my heart skip. "Yes," I said softly. "Exactly like that." That night, I made a decision that had been forming since the moment I'd learned the truth. I would reclaim my birth name, not completely, but enough to honor the mother who had never stopped looking for me. Cassandra Chapman Barnes, a name that acknowledged all parts of my journey. The family I'd been born to, the family I'd made with Tom, and the woman I'd become through it all. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Conversations with lawyers about testifying against Harold Reynolds. Discussions about what role, if any, the Blackfoot tribe whose ancestral lands had been part of the Chapman Ranch might play in rectifying decades-old wrongs. Plans for introducing my children to their great-grandmother properly, perhaps even moving closer to her. But for tonight, the truth was enough. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was, and it had nothing to do with the Reynolds name or legacy. 6 months later, on a perfect Montana summer evening, I stood on the porch of a modest farmhouse watching my children chase fireflies across the yard. Emma's delighted laughter mingled with Jake's determined counting as they competed to see who could catch more of the glowing insects in their cupped hands. "Don't hurt them," called Margaret Graham from her rocking chair beside me. "Just look, then let them go." So much had changed in those 6 months. It sometimes felt like I was living someone else's life. Harold Reynolds had been arrested in February, the federal charges against him including fraud, tax evasion, witness tampering, and a host of environmental violations. The case had made headlines across Montana, the fall of one of the state's most prominent ranchers. He was currently awaiting sentencing, though his lawyers continued filing appeals and motions to delay the inevitable. Margaret Reynolds had avoided criminal charges, but had lost most of the family assets when the courts froze Harold's accounts and began the process of returning illegally acquired properties to their rightful owners. She'd moved to Arizona to live with a distant cousin, her social standing in Montana irreparably damaged. Stephanie had faced her own reckoning. Richard, seeing which way the wind was blowing, had turned state's evidence against Harold in exchange for immunity. In the process, he'd implicated Stephanie in knowledge of the crimes, if not direct participation. Their marriage had not survived the betrayal. Last I'd heard, she was living in Seattle, trying to rebuild her life far from the scandal. The Chapman Ranch, my biological family's property, had been partially returned to the Blackfoot tribe, whose ancestral lands it had once been. The remainder had been placed in a trust, with Margaret Chapman and myself as trustees. We'd moved into the old foreman's house on the property, renovating it into a comfortable home for 3 generations. I'd used my portion of the settlement money to establish a rural medical clinic serving ranch families who had previously had to travel hours for basic care. My nursing license had been reinstated, and I divided my time between the clinic and consulting for Blackwood Enterprises on their community health initiatives. The children had adjusted to our new life with the resilience of youth. They'd transferred to the local school mid-year and quickly made friends. They adored their great-grandmother, soaking up her stories of the Chapman family history and learning traditional skills she was eager to pass down. And Nate had become far more than the stranger who collapsed on my parents' doorstep on Christmas Eve. After the initial chaos settled, we'd begun a cautious friendship that gradually deepened into something more. He'd been patient, understanding my need to establish independence before considering a relationship. His ranch was just 30 minutes from ours, close enough for regular visits, but far enough to maintain our separate lives. "Penny for your thoughts," said a familiar voice, and I turned to find Nate climbing the porch steps, a bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. "Just counting blessings," I replied, accepting both the flowers and the kiss he offered. "Quite a change from Christmas Eve," he observed, settling into the chair beside my grandmother. "Nathan, dear." Graham greeted him warmly. "Just in time for pie." "I never miss pie night," he assured her with a grin. The ease between them warmed my heart. Nate had embraced my newfound family connections without reservation, recognizing how important it was for me to establish those bonds. In turn, Margaret had welcomed him, seeing past the billionaire label to the man who had helped reunite her with her granddaughter. "Dad," Jake shouted, spotting Nate on the porch. The title had emerged naturally about 2 months ago, after Nate had patiently taught Jake to ride his first horse. The first time Jake had called him Dad, we'd all frozen, waiting for my reaction. But it had felt right, acknowledging the role Nate had taken in their lives while never diminishing the memory of Tom. Emma raced up the steps behind her brother, fireflies temporarily forgotten. "Did you bring the stuff for us, Mores?" "You promised." "In the truck," Nate confirmed, accepting her enthusiastic hug. "Along with a surprise." "What surprise?" both children demanded in unison. "If I told you, it wouldn't be a surprise," he pointed out reasonably. "But it might have something to do with tomorrow's trail ride." As the children peppered him with questions, Stephanie's car pulled into the driveway. A modest sedan that reflected her changed circumstances. She'd begun visiting monthly, part of a tentative reconciliation process that had started when she'd reached out after her divorce. Her children, Amelia and Liam, had maintained contact with their cousins throughout the family turmoil, showing more loyalty than their parents had. "Sorry I'm late," she called, walking up the path. Traffic from Missoula was terrible. Our relationship remained complicated. The wounds were too deep for instant healing, and her role in our parents' deception had been substantial. But she was making genuine efforts to change, to understand her complicity in the toxic family dynamic, and to build healthier relationships with her children and with me. "You're just in time for the campfire," I told her. "The kids are about to make esmores." The evening unfolded with the comfortable rhythm we'd established over recent months. Nate built a fire in the stone pit behind the house. Graham brought out her famous apple pie. The children roasted marshmallows and shared stories of their week's adventures. Stephanie participated quietly, still finding her place in this new family configuration. Later, after the children were in bed and Graham had retired for the night, Nate and I sat alone by the dying fire. Stephanie had left to stay at the local hotel, promising to return for tomorrow's trail ride. "It's been exactly 6 months," Nate observed, his arm around my shoulders as we watched the embers glow. "Since Christmas Eve." "Hard to believe," I agreed. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes like another lifetime." Any regrets? I considered the question seriously. About leaving the Reynolds?
No.
About not discovering the truth sooner? Maybe. I wish I'd had the chance to meet Elizabeth. He nodded, understanding as always. She would be proud of you, I think. Of the way you've handled everything, of the mother you are to Emma and Jake. I hope so. I rested my head against his shoulder, content in the peaceful moment. After a companionable silence, Nate shifted slightly. I have something to ask you, he said, his voice holding an uncharacteristic note of nervousness. Okay, I replied, curious at his tone. He took a small box from his pocket, and my heart skipped. This isn't because you need rescuing, he said carefully. You've proven beyond any doubt that you can stand on your own. It's not because of the children, though I love them as my own. It's simply because I love you, Cassandra Chapman Barnes, and I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like, however you want to define it. He opened the box to reveal a simple but stunning ring, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. Will you marry me? The question hung in the air between us, weighted with all we'd been through, all we'd learned about each other in the crucible of crisis and its aftermath. Yes, I said simply. Not because I need you, but because I choose you. Every day. His smile as he slipped the ring onto my finger held all the warmth and promise of the future we would build together. Not a fairy tale rescue, but a partnership of equals who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. 1 year to the day after that fateful Christmas Eve, we gathered for a very different celebration. The ranch house was decorated with simple greenery and white lights. A modest tree stood in the corner, adorned with ornaments the children had made. Margaret presided over the kitchen, directing preparations for a feast that honored both Chapman and Barnes family traditions. Snow fell gently outside, but this time there was no fear, only beauty in the white blanket covering the land. The doorbell rang just as we were setting the table. I'll get it, I called, crossing to the front door. A young woman stood on the porch, huddled in a heavy coat, looking uncertain. I'm sorry to intrude, she said hesitantly. My car slid off the road about a mile back. The GPS said there was a house here. Without hesitation, I opened the door wider. Come in, I said warmly. You're welcome here. As the stranger stepped gratefully into the warmth of our home, I caught Nate's eye across the room. His smile reflected my own thoughts, how a single act of kindness on a snowy night could change everything, how family was something you could build rather than simply inherit, how sometimes being thrown out into the cold was what ultimately led you home. Later, as we all gathered around the table, my grandmother, my children, my husband, Stephanie and her children, and our unexpected guest who turned out to be a wildlife photographer documenting winter migration patterns, I offered a toast. To family, I said, raising my glass. Not defined by blood or name, but by love, respect, and doing what's right even when it's difficult. To family, they echoed, glasses clinking in the warm light. I think about that Christmas Eve sometimes, when my father threw us out into the snow. In his mind, it was the ultimate punishment, the worst thing he could do to force my compliance. He couldn't have known it would be the greatest gift he ever gave us, freedom from toxic bonds, the chance to discover my true heritage, and the opportunity to build a family founded on genuine love rather than obligation and appearances. If you've ever found yourself standing in the cold, cast out by those who should have protected you, know this. Sometimes the path forward lies through the storm. Sometimes losing what you thought was family leads you to discover what family truly means. And sometimes the people who show up in your darkest moments, bleeding cowboys, long-lost grandmothers, or others who see your worth when you've been told you have none, become the foundation of something far stronger than what you left behind. Have you ever experienced a moment when family betrayal turned into an unexpected blessing? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this journey of family karma and unexpected redemption resonated with you, please consider subscribing to hear more stories of truth and healing. Like this video if you believe in the power of chosen family, and share it with someone who might need to be reminded that blood isn't always thicker than water. Sometimes it's the bonds we forge in the storms that truly last. Thank you for coming on this journey with me, and remember, the family that matters most is the one that shows up when it counts.